All right, hello everyone. Today I want to talk about my master's thesis, and this is really just about inquiry-based learning, and specifically how it's going to impact the students' mathematical competencies, which I'll talk more about what I mean by competencies later on. So just some preliminaries, this is really just what I found in the literature review. To make a long story short, a common theme that I saw in review of the literature was that IBL does influence conceptual understanding, and it definitely has an increase in student interest and attitude, as we see in this study here, we see in this study, and I even believe more so, yep, and here. So the bulk of the literature is really saying, yes, there is an influence in conceptual understanding, and there's a strong influence on engagement and participation in the classroom. And this makes sense when you think about what IBL really aims to do, right? It's a student-centered approach to instruction. And when you have something that's student-centered, it makes sense. You might be holding more student-led discussions, you might be immersing them in more discovery-based activities, and contrary to direct instruction, which is more teacher-centered, they're not necessarily collecting notes or following along a whiteboard. And I hate to use the phrase copy pasting, but sometimes direct instruction can feel very copy paste-esque, right? IBL does quite the opposite. So it almost makes sense that, yeah, there is an increase in participation. Even if the students don't want to, IBL almost requires them to. So that's just really what the literature review is saying. And now, before I talk about my research, I did want to very briefly cover my motivation behind this. And this is just, I guess, my experiences as a student and a teacher. And what I have seen, again, my experiences, right? And this is why I have the motivation to, I guess, conduct such a study. Now, teacher-centered approaches to instruction, there's nothing wrong with them. In fact, I don't have the literature in front of me here, right? But there's a reason why it's such a common instructional approach. And it's because it produces results as far as assessment goes. And that's what, administrators are looking for when they want to say, well, our school is finishing in X percentile in math, science, history, etc., right? How well can our students do on the test? And I think teacher-centered approaches are aptly suited for that. But if we think about students as lifelong learners, I don't believe teacher-centered instruction is the best for that. Not to say it's bad, but I definitely think immersing them in an inquiry environment may be more optimal for something like a lifelong learning process, right? And again, this is stuff that I'll cover, but teacher-centered approaches to instruction, not to knock on it, but I think they offer less chances for students to really immerse themselves in discovery. And it's more catered for the test. So let's see how inquiry-based learning may differ from that. So these are my study objectives. I would really classify this as a primary objective here, and this is kind of more a secondary objective. That really just being, how can teachers optimize IBL for themselves if they're already using IBL or if they're thinking about implementing it one day in the future. But again, really I'm just looking to examine the effectiveness of inquiry learning. Now my research method was pretty straightforward. I included both quantitative and qualitative questions, or I guess this kind of data I was collecting, and this is through the use of Likert level questions, open-ended questions, and just some basic categorical questions. And again, my motive, I just covered it, but this is just so I can do a deep dive into inquiry-based learning and seeing how that influences student learning. And I guess my research was collected upon a survey, and this was purposive sampling. Now what I mean by that is I specifically wanted to survey math educators. Most of them were math high school teachers. Some were math middle school teachers. Very few were elementary, and I had a handful of professors as well. So I really had quite a large range, and I believe about 55 participants were in my study. And if I get right to the results, I first want to talk about this graph here, and I secondly want to talk about my correlation tests. Now, this graph is collected from a question that I asked in my survey, and that question being, how do you perceive, or I guess I really should reword it, among the competencies listed here, which have you seen most affected by inquiry-based learning? And among the 55 participants, again, we see nearly 40 out of the 55 are saying problem solving. And second to that, conceptual understanding, about 36. Now, that's a good chunk of data to say, well, I saw an increase in these fluencies. Not so much procedural fluency, and that makes sense when we think about it, because, again, that might be a lot higher for something like direct instruction, where you can very clearly see the teacher go step by step on how to solve a problem. Whereas inquiry-based learning, we're not really doing that. We're trying to get the students to figure out the steps on their own through asking questions, immersing them in discovery-based activities, having discussions, so it might not be as clear. But when you have such discussions, it kind of makes sense for why the concepts would be a little bit higher, why that problem solving would be a little bit higher, because the opportunities to do so are there, right? Now, if we tie this in with our correlations, I really want to talk about this bottom one here and this top one. Now, each of these have a little asterisk, and all that means is that these correlations were found to be statistically significant, meaning that these correlations are not just by chance. They actually have some kind of meaning. So if I talk about this bottom one first, we have a strong positive correlation, meaning that IBL usage in the classroom is highly related with incorporating student-led discussions. Now, this isn't really saying much in the context of our study. It's really just verifying the fact that student-led discussions are, in a way, inquiry-based learning, right? So if you're having student-led discussions in your classroom, that doesn't mean you're literally saying, yeah, I use IBL, but it's an attribute of IBL. And this, in a way, is transitive, because here, this says, to what extent do you currently use IBL in your classroom? And how do you see changes in student participation and engagement? Now, I literally shouldn't say it's transitive, but I mean, we could break this down too. But more often than not, if you're using IBL, then odds are you are going to see that change in your student participation and engagement, and that being an increase in student engagement and participation. And again, there's a moderately strong correlation there. And even this one in the middle, also moderately strong. The use of student-led discussions, which we saw were highly affiliated with IBL, also leads to changes in student participation and engagement, with a somewhat similar correlation going on here. Now, needless to say, if there's any takeaway from the results in this study specifically, it's that conceptual understanding and problem-solving ability are mostly influenced by inquiry-based learning, right? And this is me just kind of speed running through this. If I wanted to make this a 30-minute video, I would, and I would slowly break down, I guess, each of the following criteria and each of these competencies, but I unfortunately do not have the time to do so. But I will talk about the suggestions for the future. So I guess keeping in mind with my research and also what the literature review is saying, IBL implementation is a lot easier with admin support. Now, I guess I didn't talk about that too much in the above section, but research from the literature review had made this claim in one or two studies. But in my study specifically, I had a section where participants in my study could answer a question saying, what would help you the most in implementing IBL? And one of the most frequent answers was having support from the admin. Now, that doesn't mean that the end-all be-all will be, oh, well, if I don't have proper admin support, I should just give up and not use IBL. That's not true, but it's certainly a lot easier when the administration is there to support you, right? Because a lot of IBL implementation, it's not easy. It takes a lot of reflection, which is another thing that was found in the literature review, to successfully implement, whereas teacher-centered, not that that's also easy to implement, but it may feel a lot less trial and error based, you know. Another huge suggestion for the future, and this is found in both the literature review and in my research, but is just having more opportunities for those student-led discussions, because when those opportunities are there, you're giving the students an opportunity to learn the concepts on their own, discuss amongst their peers, and that, in a way, increases their problem-solving ability and understanding of a concept, right? If they're having these discussions amongst themselves. And again, that's kind of what I'm saying here. So if I really could critique my own research, I would honestly, there's a lot to critique here. And I mean that in a good way. I think, first and foremost, if I had a larger sample size, not that 55 is small, but it certainly could have been a lot larger. Or better yet, I think that if this was a longitudinal study, so in other words, if we took this study and instead of measuring it over a short amount of time just through a survey, maybe we can measure real student data over the course of a few years, right? Because IBL is a process, and especially if we're going to be surveying or collecting data on teachers where maybe IBL isn't so familiar, we might need it to be longitudinal in order to see its change, right? And that might be a good way to compare direct instruction versus IBL instruction. And also including some kind of student feedback. I think it's important to ask the students what works for them, right? And that's not something that my research specifically considered. But again, in a perfect world, and if I had all the time in the world, I think that getting direct feedback from the students, yes, I do like this form of instruction, or no, I'm not really a fan, I prefer X, Y, and Z. I think that's another good way of collecting data for this kind of study. And that's really it. If you found this to be helpful, I really appreciate that, and I'm glad that you did find it helpful. But in any case, I hope you have a good day, and thank you for taking the time to watch this.